I love India. I love the colors of India. I love the orange and the red and the pinks that you guys have so vibrant in your culture. I love the food of India. I love biryani. I love paneer tikka. And I especially love tandoori. It is my favorite. Yeah. But there's another reason that I love India so deeply. And JC, do we have the photo? This is the main reason that I love India so deeply. This is my son Mordecai. He's from Hassan, so just north of Bangalore. We've had him at home in the U.S., a part of our family, the fourth child of our family, for about a year. And so he's 2 years old. He has brought so much joy to our family. He loves Mickey Mouse. He loves dogs and cats, and he loves his mama. And at times that leaves me jealous. But my honor today is to share with you the church's responsibility in orphan care, adoption, and especially caring for the vulnerable. And so my big idea for you is this. It's something that Herbie has already shared with us, this truth that God's adoption of sinners is the highest privilege of the gospel. And if it is, likewise, the church's care for the vulnerable is one of the most tangible expressions of the gospel. Our church, my church in the U.S., your church in India, the church in China, the church all over the world, its care for the vulnerable is one of the most tangible expressions of the gospel. Now, we're going to build this case. I want to build this case with you, and I want to show you the severity with which God holds his church and commands his church to care for the vulnerable. It's more than an individual effort of the pastor. It is a corporate effort. It's a communal effort that God calls a movement of his gathered people to serve the vulnerable. But I want you to go back with me, as Herbie has already shared with us, and I want to show you something in Exodus. Exodus chapter 22, verse 21. This is the role of Judaism, or the religion of the Jewish people prior to Jesus, and how God had commanded them to care for the vulnerable. Most theologians refer to this as the quartet of the vulnerable, the four groups of people that are after God's heart, that God says, I care deeply for them, I move for them, I fight on their behalf, and I expect those who are in my assembly, those who are my children, those who are my people, to fight and work on their behalf. And I want you to just see this because this is important to understand where we're going when we get to Matthew chapter 12. But it says this, you shall not wrong the sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. Now look at this, verse 23. Look at the severity with which God has, the passion with which God shares for the mistreatment of widows and the fatherless, the sojourner. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn. And look at this. I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend, in the fourth group, if you lend money to any of my people with who is poor, you shall not be like a money lender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. You see, we see this promise or this command to God's assembled people, the Jewish faith, in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy, we see it on display in the book of Ruth that we've just seen and heard from Brother Herbie. We see it on display in some of the characters and people of the Old Testament, like Moses, who is adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. We see it that Jesus is adopted by Joseph, his father. And so we see this on display in the Old Testament. We also see it on display, this same idea, this same command from God, that we as the gathering of God, the community of believers moving for a purpose, we are, as we go in that, we are to reach and care for the vulnerable. So James 1:27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Now, I know this is information that all of us have already heard these past 2 days. So I want you to flip with me, and I want us to see something that for me, the passage in Exodus, the passages in Deuteronomy, the stories of Ruth, the stories of Moses, the stories of Jesus are all stories that I was familiar with. And then at my church, we were preaching through the book of Mark, and we came to this passage, and I read this passage in a new and enlightening way, and God spoke to me through this in a way that gave so much clarity as to the severity, the priority with which God holds the vulnerable and the church's care for the vulnerable. Here this passage is in Mark chapter 12. So turn your Bibles, if you will, with me. We really need to read this to see it. Mark chapter 12, verse 38. We're going to break it into three short sections. Verse 38. Jesus is approaching the last days of his ministry, approaching the last week of his ministry. He's in Jerusalem. He will not leave Jerusalem again before he is crucified. In fact, this is really late in his ministry where he knows he is going to the cross. He is convincing his disciples that he is going to the cross, and we see Jesus frustrated. We see him angry, and I want you to see that with me. Verse 38, and in his teaching he said, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces, and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts. And then verse 40, I want you to see this, who devour widows' houses and for pretense make long prayers. And look at the last line, the last sentence there. They will receive the greater condemnation. I want you to underline that last sentence. I want you to circle the word widows or devouring widows' houses. So Jesus gives this instruction to his disciples, this word of warning to his disciples, and then he turns and we see what he is talking about on display. And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting the money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came in and put 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him, and he said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had and all she had to live on. Now, if we see this tied in, connected to the warning that he had just given his disciples, it's more this text, this teaching, which we've traditionally shared as a teaching on giving, on how we are to give of our finances to God, how are we to give sacrificially for the glory of God. If we do not tie this text into that which is previous and that which will follow, we often come to this implication that God wants all of our money. But that isn't what the teaching is about at all. You see, the idea to gather here is a God who sees those who have been oppressed, a God who sees those who are vulnerable, a God who sees a religious system, a religious gathering, and it frustrates him, it infuriates him. And the wrath and the intensity of Exodus chapter 22, where he says, I will bring wrath upon you, burns inside of the incarnate Jesus, God in the flesh. When men and women would walk with their wealth and prosperity, and there would be the offering box would be this giant trumpet or trombone-like instrument made of brass. And so when you put your money in, it would make the loudest noise. Whoever made the loudest noise was considered the most honorable giver. See, but Jesus is infuriated here. He's not impressed by the sound of the change in the offering box. You see, he is depressed. He is frustrated with a culture, a religion who curses and oppresses those who are already oppressed. You see, it isn't an exoneration of a poor widow who gives, but the curse of a religious system that oppresses her. Now I want you to read on with me to chapter 13. What happens next? And he came out of the temple. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. Think of this. They don't understand Jesus' countenance. They don't understand the fury that is burning, the frustration that is raging, the wrath that is within him. And Jesus says, Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Jesus has just cursed the religious system of old. He has just established the reality, or revealed the reality, that there will be a new faith system, a new gathering, a new people, the Christian church. And Jesus kept his promise to see these stones unturned. This was at 33 AD when Jesus makes this statement that you will see these stones fall. The temple in Jerusalem, Herod's temple, was considered one of the ninth wonder of the ancient world at that time. Beautiful, immaculate, stones of marble the size of buses and cars stacked together for years and years by thousands of people. The exterior of the temple and the interior of the temple were both inlaid with gold. It was an immaculate, beautiful place built on the backs of the vulnerable. Now, in 70 AD, just a generation, right? Just a generation removed from 33 AD. In 70 AD, the Roman Empire marches into Jerusalem, sets fire to this temple as a result of the revolt that is going on in Jerusalem. And the gold inlaid in those stones melts and drips down into the cracks of the stones. And so the Roman general in charge has that temple taken apart, block by block, stone by stone, with their rubble and stones overturned so that he might have the gold that was inlaid in that temple. You see, Jesus keeps his promises, even if they're a promise of a curse, even if they're a condemnation of a religious system that oppresses the poor and the widow and the vulnerable. But he also, as he issues this curse, he sits with his disciples, who would be the leader of the church, who would be the leader of the new movement, and he gives them that command. As it is a curse to the old system, it's a command to the new system, that if God had adopted them and he was their father, if that was their confession, then their expression must be to care for, to minister to serve the vulnerable. And if God has adopted me and you, he is our father, is our confession, then our expression must be that we care for the orphan. We care for the vulnerable. We adopt. We develop systems in our church, and we celebrate the work like Isaac is doing and Krupa is doing in our communities. You see, what we find is that this work, this expression of caring for the vulnerable, is the great qualifier for gospel proclamation. It opens the hearts and minds of those who do not know God when they see his church serving the vulnerable. Now, the question that looms is, did the disciples heed this command of Jesus? Did the disciples heed the command of Jesus to care for the vulnerable? And the answer in short is yes. For centuries, at least the first few centuries, we see the church serving the vulnerable. In fact, the church is made up of the vulnerable. But in the 3rd century, a great plague arose in Rome, the Cyprian plague. It was so bad that even an emperor fell victim to the plague and died. It struck even the highest authorities of Rome. And every city in Rome was ravaged with the Cyprian plague. People were dying, and anyone who stayed in the city would die. So all that were wealthy, all that were affluent, all that were capable, even the pagan priests of Rome, left the cities of the Roman Empire in that 3rd century. But there was a group of people who did not leave those cities, who did not run from death, who did not run from suffering, who did not run from serving the vulnerable, the dying, and the sick. You know who those people were, don't you? They were the Christians, the pious Galileans, as history tells us. And this turns a corner in the history of Christianity. within 100 years of the Cyprian plague and the witness that is brought about by this expression of caring for the vulnerable and a God who is bigger than death, within 100 years, Christianity moves from being the illegal minority religion of the Roman Empire to the prominent majority legal religion of the Roman Empire. Historians say this is one of the turning points. And so what we find, church, is this: the responsibility of the church to care for the vulnerable becomes the church's greatest opportunity to reach the world. I'm going to say that again. The responsibility of the church to care for the vulnerable becomes the church's greatest opportunity to reach the world. The work that you do with the vulnerable in your community will qualify you with those who don't know Jesus, that you might share and lead them in knowing and following Jesus, being born again and saved forever, known by the one true God, the Father in heaven. Now, as we pause, I want us to pause and move from this, and I want to give you just, as a pastor, I'm a pastor, many of you are pastors. I would say there are two tensions that we could kind of come into when moving our church into this movement, of leading our church into these ideas of caring for the vulnerable. I think the one tension is that we teach about it, but we don't act on it. And I want to just say, your church will not take you seriously if you talk about serving the vulnerable, you talk about caring for the vulnerable, you talk about adoption and orphans, but you do nothing as a pastor, as a person, as a leader. One, you must teach on it. You must teach it from the scriptures and texts like this and texts like Herbie has shared with us and texts like other speakers have shared with you this week. Then there's another tension, I think, maybe a tension that is more difficult for your culture than my culture. The tension that would rise if we reached to serve the vulnerable but didn't talk about it, but felt as if we couldn't share what God had done through us. And as a result of us walking into his work, of us serving the vulnerable. So we must reach to the vulnerable, but we should also teach. I think this is a lesson that I've learned as I've moved through as a pastor who adopted in the States. It's not a question that you guys ask, it's a question that everyone asks. Why would you adopt a child from India? Why would you adopt a child from India? Why would you adopt a child? I have 3 biological children, and God led me down this journey to adopt this 4th child, and I love him deeply. You see, we think that humility says, I can't talk about what God is doing. That's not true. Humility is this: I can talk about the work of God through me. I can share it. I can celebrate it, and it will be repeated. That would be my encouragement to you, pastors. As Isaac and Tara and Satara have shared with you, honestly and openly, about their adoption journey, you should do the same as you lead your church in that path, in that way. It's not arrogant or prideful. It's just being honest. It's being obedient. It's being available to God. So, my question to you is, what are you doing? Have you taken up this great opportunity to reach the world? Have you taken up this great responsibility to care for the vulnerable? Would you pray with me? Father, we are thankful and gracious and grateful for your graciousness. God, I'm thankful for the journey that you have led me and my wife on. God, I thank you for the people that are adopting today because we shared the story of your work in our lives. And God, I pray that over this congregation of people. I pray that over this assembly of leaders, God. That they would care for the vulnerable and they would share of how they care and how they're working and how you're working through them. And God, that as they celebrate it, you would repeat your glory, your work, and your mercy. Oh God, use these people to bring change, to bring impact, that we might see a generation of people saved from vulnerability, but also saved for the glory of God in heaven. Oh God, use us for your glory. In your name, amen.